All right. Good evening, everybody. If you would, open up your Bible or get your scripture journal cranking over to Mark, the 14th chapter, as we will for sure conclude this lengthy chapter this evening, Mark 14, and then we'll see how far we get into chapter 15 as we continue to watch and observe and as I said in the prayer a moment ago, to try to place ourselves in this scene as we watch Jesus go through these trials and through the difficulties that He underwent. And there's all these other kind of supporting characters that are in the scene as well. And as we look at those supporting characters, those are the characters that maybe we see ourselves in, unfortunately. These characters who, many of them are not doing the right thing, many of them are flat out just doing the wrong thing, and if there's things that are amiss in our own lives, we want to be able to see ourselves here and then not make the same mistakes that these people did. But appreciate very much the opportunity to get to study these things with you as we have for these last few months, and we are nearing the end of this great gospel. In Mark the 14th chapter, we're picking up tonight in verse 66, and this is after Jesus has been arrested and He has been taken through kind of the first official round of court proceedings, if you even want to call it that, because what did take place there in the verses that we studied and closed with last week, verses 53 through 65, nothing about this was legal, nothing about it was proper or right in any sort of way, but they go through the process, and they're going to go through it again. Mark's not going to tell us about them doing it this second time, but they've reached a verdict, and that is that this Jesus guy, He needs to die. We've got Him hooked on, for us, blasphemy. And so, hey, for us, that's good enough. Let's get rid of Him and let's start the process to actually get Him executed. And that's what they want next. While all of that is going on with Jesus being taken through this first trial with the Sanhedrin Council, Mark records for us that there is this second scene that is kind of playing at the same time. Imagine like a stereo track where here's track 1 and Jesus is on track 1, but this second track is playing at the exact same time, and that's the story of Peter. What is Peter doing during all of this? And Peter has been at least probably the most prominent of all of the disciples in Mark's gospel up to this point. What's going on with Peter? Well, Mark tells us here, beginning in verse 66. So let's remind ourselves, we are here late in the early morning hours of Friday morning now. And so we're told there in verse 66 that as Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the servant girls of the high priest came, and seeing Peter warming himself, looked at him and said, "You also were with the Nazarene Jesus." So we've got Peter here kind of at a distance from where Jesus is as He's being taken through kangaroo court. And of course, when we read this section, in fact, if we just read this whole chapter all together, there's a tendency on our part, I think, to kind of just motor through this and think all of this happened in the span of 2 seconds or, just a few minutes, especially when you read about the 3 denials of Peter here. It might kind of come across like this just happened like bang, bang, bang. I don't think that's exactly how that happened. These trials where Jesus is brought before Annas and then brought before Caiaphas, this is taking place probably in those hours between, say, 1 a.m. and 3 a.m. That's where lots of scholars and commentators kind of peg it in somewhere in those hours, which means that these denials of Peter are kind of over a prolonged period of time, over a couple of hours. Again, it wasn't just bang, 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 denial, denial, denial. No, it kind of intensifies as the couple of hours progress on. And I'm bringing that up, and I want us to be mindful of the fact that it is late at night, because Peter, probably much like Jesus, probably was pretty tired. We already noticed that Peter was tired when they were in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he couldn't stay awake to stay up with Jesus through through those moments that Jesus asked him and the other disciples to stay up with him. So we know already that he had been tired, and my guess is he's probably even more tired by this point in the evening. And the reason I want to draw attention to the fact that maybe some tiredness is going on is because fatigue, physical fatigue, has a way of just weakening our defenses spiritually. Isn't that true? I'm always reminded of that quote that George Patton is credited as saying, and that is that fatigue makes cowards of us all. which is why he always wanted his soldiers to be in tip-top shape, to where they were always alert and mindful, because again, when you're tired, your defenses just go down. And you're not as alert and you're not as on guard as you need to be. And I think maybe some of that is working here with Peter. I'm not trying to give some kind of an excuse for Peter or give him an out in any kind of way. I'm just saying that is the reality. And that's probably ought to be a warning to us that, rest is good. There's a reason the Lord commends rest, and He's always showing us the example of being a restful person even throughout His life, and that is when we're well rested, when we're alert, that helps us in our battle against the devil. And so I want us to be mindful of that as we think about Peter here. We might be wondering, how in the world is Peter even here in this scene? Remember, when Jesus was arrested, everybody scattered. We don't want to be near Jesus because we're afraid we might get arrested too. So how is Peter even here within, a stone's throw distance, or however far away he was from the actual palace where this whole trial is taking place? And here now, where Peter, it says, and there in verse 66, he's below in the courtyard, presumably the courtyard of the palace of the high priest. You might be wondering, well, how did he even get in there? Well, this is where actually John's account helps us out a little bit, and this is a detail that I must confess to you, I just never really paid attention to prior to my studies preparing for tonight. In John the 18th chapter, we're told in verses 15 and 16 that there was actually another disciple who was also following at a distance, and that disciple is not named, but lots of folks tend to believe that maybe this was John. John quite frequently throughout his gospel makes mention of the disciple whom Jesus loved, and that seems to be a pretty clear kind of marker pointing out it's John, but John's just not wanting to refer to himself by name. And so lots of folks think that this is John here as well, until in John chapter 18 and in verse 15 we're told Peter stood outside the door, so the other disciple who was known to the high priest went out and spoke to that servant girl who kept watch at the door and brought Peter in. And so, if this is John or whatever other disciple this was, they have some kind of a known relationship with the high priest, and maybe the servants there are aware of who this guy is. And so John's able to use that relationship to say, hey, can you let him in as well? And so Peter's able to slip in as well, and again, be there in the courtyard. He's not next to Jesus, but he's at least maybe close enough to where maybe he can see him from afar. We're going to notice that here in just a few minutes, that when Jesus is led away, he does see Peter. He locks eyes with Peter, but he's able to be at a distance from the Lord. And I want you to keep that in mind here in just a moment as we think about the distance between Peter and Jesus and how I think that contributes to Peter's failure here. So we have this first person, this servant girl, who looks at him and says, hey, you, I think I recognize you. You've been spotted before as being with that Nazarene fella who's over here and who's, being arraigned and going through all of this process here. I think you're one of those guys. I think you're one of those disciples. Verse 68. But Peter denied it, saying, I neither know nor understand what you mean. And he went out into the gateway, and the rooster crowed. So this first denial of Peter is Peter says, hey, I don't know what you're talking about. Don't have a clue what you mean by any of this, which is a lie. Maybe that's the other thing we ought to say about these denials, is that, just another way of saying it, is they're lies. Peter is lying here. And I want you to see how these denials just increase with their intensity each time. So the first one is, hey, I don't even know what you're talking about here, lady. Verse 69. And the servant girl saw him, this is after the roosters crowed that first time, and the servant girl saw him and began again to say to the bystanders, this man, he is one of them. So there's these, of course, other people down there in the courtyard. We're told in the other accounts that there had been this fire that had been made, and some of the officers and some of those servants, they're down there warming their hands by the fire. And so this servant girl comes down and she says, hey guys, a guy over here, a guy right there, I think he's one of those disciples of Jesus. Gets lots of other people riled up. Verse 70, but again, he denied it. Now, if you add Matthew's account, Matthew chapter 26, Matthew says that this second time when he denied it with an oath. So now it's not just, hey, I don't know what you're talking about. Now it's, oh, hey, I swear. I swear, I don't know what you're talking about. I'm not him. You got the wrong guy. I'm giving my word on that, giving a special promise and a special oath about that. I'm not that guy. So we've ratcheted up a little bit. We've notched it up a little bit with the intensity of the denial here. Verse 70, but again he denied it, and after a little while the bystanders again said to him, certainly you are one of them, for you're a Galilean. Verse 71 now, but he began to invoke a curse on himself and to swear, I do not know this man of whom you speak. Look at the intensity now. We've ratcheted it up a second time. Now it's not just, I don't know what you're talking about. And now it's not just, I don't know what you're talking about, and I swear I'm not him. Now it's, I swear I'm not him, and if I'm lying, may a curse be brought down upon me. And you've probably had conversations with people before. In fact, who knows, maybe you've even been guilty of this yourself, where you're telling a lie, or somebody's telling what appears to be a lie, and you're having a hard time believing what they're saying, when maybe they give their first response. And so what do they usually do? Got to up the ante a little bit, don't they? I swear to God, I swear on a stack of Bibles, may the Lord strike me down with lightning if I'm telling a lie. And it just kind of begins to escalate more and more and more. And as you hear people say that kind of stuff, I don't know if you're like me, my thought usually is, this guy's lying. This guy is telling a bold-faced lie. Of course, Jesus is the one who earlier in his teachings in the Sermon on the Mount and other places talked about how let your yes be yes, let your no be no. You don't need to be making all these big kinds of oaths. That's not what God's people are to be about. We're going to be the kind of people who are just defined by our integrity and our honesty, that when we give our word, that's what it means. We don't need to give all these, extra things to kind of make our word, increase the intensity and make it more strong. No, we're just going to be people who say the word, and that's just what the truth of the matter is. Peter here is doing the exact opposite of all of that, as he just builds worse and worse and worse. Verse 70, you might even make a note there when it says that the person said, certainly you are one of them, for you are a Galilean. Matthew's account is what adds that it's his accent that gives him away. There was something about people who lived down in the region of Galilee. They just had a certain accent. Last month when I was preaching up in Indiana, getting to meet a lot of folks that I had never met before, and they didn't know me, didn't even know where I was even coming from, and standing there, in the entranceway as folks are coming in, hi, how you doing? Good to meet you. And every now and then there was a couple of different folks that said, you sound like you're from Kentucky. And you just tell it, and I don't hear my own accent, but apparently other people do when you go to those northern states. But that was a thing here with Peter. His accent was betraying him, and people were able to recognize that he was one of these Galilee folks. And of course, Jesus had been, dominant in his work in Galilee, and there was lots of followers of his who were Galileans, not just the members of the apostles, but lots of other people that were followers of Jesus were Galilean folks. And so that was kind of a dead giveaway that he was one of them. And Peter just kind of keeps locking down on his lies and on his denials. And it is at this point that verse 72 then tells us that immediately the rooster crowed a second time, and Peter remembered. He remembered how Jesus had said to him, before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. And he broke down and he wept. Now, it is somewhere, maybe in the seam of verse 72, that Luke's account of this gives that added detail that the Lord turned and looked at Peter. And there's lots that could be said about that. I guess maybe just what I would say about that is that's just a look that I'm going to guess Peter never forgot. That it would have been the kind of thing that just would have been seared into his mind from that point forward about Jesus staring at him, and there's this recognition of what the Lord had said previous to this, the warnings, the prophesying that Jesus had done about what Peter would do on this very occasion, and then the recognition that Peter couldn't live up to his own boastful words. He was not able to stand for Jesus when the time came. He actually is denying the Lord not once, not twice, but 3 times. Thoughts, things that you want to say here about Peter. I've got an application or two that I want to make, but I'm going to open the floor to you. What do you want to say here about the activities of what's going on here? Maybe things from the parallel accounts that you'd want to draw in, or just anything in general here about Peter's denial.
Peter seemed to have an awful lot of faith. He was following through when they came to get Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
That striking the ear of the high priest, he was probably trying to dead center his head with the sword. You're probably not that good to just nip an ear off.
Yeah.
Trying to kill the man.
Yeah.
Which, facing an overwhelming crowd, was pretty brave.
Yeah.
But once he found out that Jesus was not going to fight physically, his faith just fell away. He was willing to die for Jesus as long as we could fight. But if it was going to give yourself to someone, his faith just went away.
Yeah. Glenn's made the point for those who weren't able to hear that, Peter was pretty bold and brazen when his thinking had led him to believe that, hey, we're going to be involved in a physical fight and physical warfare. And of course, he pulled that sword out and swiped the ear of Malchus, and Jesus quickly rebukes that, and of course heals the man's ear. And that's when it seems like Peter's faith really took a huge blow. He's ready to fight for Jesus in that kind of a way, but the idea that Jesus is actually going to willingly give himself and is going to allow these things to take place, it just kind of broke Peter in that moment. This, what I would suggest in many ways, was kind of a foolish confidence that he had before that moment, now has quickly turned to just this failed cowardice. That's what's going on here. Foolish confidence led to this failing cowardice here at this moment. What else here?
Josh, I think as we get older, we learn that we don't always go around and say, I will do this and I will do that. Because it really is true that you don't always know what you will do.
Yeah.
Peter was rambunctious. Maybe, I don't know his age, but I think that played into it. We know he was fearful, just like the rest. They ran. They let fear, cause them to forsake the Lord.
Yeah. Mickey's made the point that, when we're as we get older and mature, certainly especially in the faith, we're maybe a little bit less inclined to be so strong-willed and to say, oh, I'll do this, and where we have almost maybe even borders on kind of an arrogance and a boastfulness and a pride that shouldn't be there. We learn and we start to recognize our own limitations, and that is exactly right. I think it is safe to say that certainly at this point in his life, even if Peter might have been somewhat older or mature as a man as far as his age, he certainly was still very young in the faith. And really all of the disciples were young in the faith in that sense. It is amazing what Peter will become later on, but it is going to take some time, and it's going to take some learning from these mistakes. Dad's got the comment on the chat that maybe Peter was somewhat disillusioned about Jesus, the fact that he didn't let him fight. And so that's why here in this moment he's quick to say, I don't even know this man. That there may be some sense in which at this point Peter's thinking, well, I don't even know who this guy is. This is not what I thought that he was going to be about. It's different than what I thought it was all going to be. So yeah, there maybe is some of that kind of work in here. What else, Carolyn?
As wrong as Peter was to do what he has done, I think we should give him credit to at least stick around close enough to find out what is happening. He cared about Christ enough to still want to be close enough to see what was going to happen to him.
Yeah. We're going to give Peter some points here for, if nothing else, he is at least present. He's at a distance, but he is present. There is this other disciple, if we presume that's John. We might be inclined to wonder, okay, if that's John that was also there, well, I mean, what was John doing? Why didn't John jump to Jesus' defense? And the answer is, we don't know. The text doesn't talk to us about John. Jesus didn't, prophesy anything about what John would say or what John would do. Maybe John just was not confronted. Maybe John, didn't have, kind of these trying moments like Peter was going to have, where people was going to recognize him and they were going to confront him and put him on the spot and ask him these questions. But Peter is the one who is placed in those positions and is the one that Scripture records for us, and he's the one that we need to try to be learning from. We probably ought to remind ourselves as well, pointed this out last week, Judas is also kind of following these proceedings as well, because it's not until he hears the condemnation that Jesus is being condemned to death that he then goes out and hangs himself. So Judas is hanging by as well, and there may be even is part of us, for me, when I think about what Peter does here, just the colossal failure on this occasion, it's a wonder that he didn't just go out and do what Judas did. It's a wonder he didn't go out and hang himself or do some other kind of a rash thing, taking his own life, or, just doing something really, really stupid. Peter, was kind of a hothead and did things impulsively, and so it's a wonder that he didn't go out and do those things, and it's by the grace of God that he was able to rebound from this event and learn from it. I've made mention a couple of times already about, that Peter is at a distance. It does make me wonder if maybe Peter would have fared possibly a little bit better if he had been in closer proximity. If he'd been there like right next to Jesus, and as Jesus is being accused of this stuff, and Peter's being maybe accused of all the, or at least, by proxy, the same things that Jesus is being accused of, wonder if maybe Peter would have been bold in that moment. Again, as Glenn pointed out a second ago, when they were there with that arresting crowd, man, Peter was bold there. After all, that was a big stage. Here in a big moment, he was ready to jump in there and do something. He maybe would have been better off, in a moment where he could have had the opportunity to pull some swords or start a fight or do something courageous in that kind of way. What all of that then says to me, and this is the point that I want to make from that, is that denying the Lord, it doesn't always happen in these big dramatic settings. When we talk about the idea of denying Jesus, the classic example, you've heard preachers say this a million times before by way of illustration. I think I've used this before as an illustration. What would you do if someone came into this church building, maybe while we're having services, and they held a gun to your head and they said, "Do you renounce your faith in Jesus Christ?" And we kind of then use that as the gold standard of whether or not we will stand for the Lord or whether we'll deny Him. Will we be courageous, or will we cower and say, "Oh, no, I don't really believe in Him," in order to save our lives? Because that's really what Peter's doing here. He's doing this in order to spare himself. And while that kind of thing does happen, think of some of the church shootings that have happened. I wonder if that very kind of scene is played out in those church shootings. Or you think about people who live overseas, who live in like the Middle East or in other places where Christianity is not welcome, and people are threatened, their own lives are called into jeopardy if you don't renounce Jesus in the moment. Those kinds of things do happen. I understand that. But by show of hands right now, has that ever happened to anybody here? That's what, no hands raised on the chat either? No. None of us have ever been in that kind of situation where our lives have been placed in jeopardy because we profess faith in Jesus Christ. Usually denying Jesus, it usually happens in small ways. Kind of like with Peter here, where we're just having conversations with folks and we're encountering groups of people where, you know what, it's just not... Well, it's just not the best thing for me to speak up or to say something here. Denying Jesus for us usually is going to take on the form of us maybe just declining to comment or to say anything in a conversation when our coworkers are talking about religion. I'll just kind of bow out of that because I'm just worried of how that might go if I get involved in that. Or it might take on the form of me just absolutely refusing to say anything when I hear someone maligning the Bible or maligning the church or maybe even just maligning God altogether because, well, that just makes me really uncomfortable and I really don't want to get into a big, long theological discussion about that. That's usually the form that that's going to take for us. And Peter here is showing us that denying the Lord just does not always happen when a terrorist is pointing a machine gun at your head. That's That's not the way that usually happens for us. It's usually going to happen in those everyday, mundane sort of settings and surroundings. And it reminds me of what Jesus actually had said a little bit earlier in Mark's Gospel. Would you just turn back in Mark chapter 8? In Mark chapter 8, I actually wonder if this statement of Jesus crossed Peter's mind as he's denying the Lord. In Mark chapter 8, back in verse 38, you remember when Jesus said this? Mark 8:38, "For whoever is ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of him will the Son of Man also be ashamed when He comes in the glory of His Father with the holy angels." Peter is guilty of that very thing right here. And I think about my own life. I just wonder how many different times in my own life I've been guilty of that kind of thing. Again, not denying Jesus in some kind of a big setting, but in all those little and small ways where I could have said something, where I should have said something, where I should have been more bold and more ready, even to face whatever consequences might have come along with that. Maybe the consequence would be a person having a strained relationship with a friend or another person. Maybe the consequence would be the person getting angry or maybe even getting a little bit volatile. But that is what it means to stand for Jesus and to follow through with the words of that song we sometimes sing, stand up for Jesus. I'm afraid that far too often we think that there's a secret service branch of Christianity, where I'll just kind of be this secret disciple where people really don't know that I'm a Christian because I kind of just go under the radar and people really wouldn't be able to tell by the way that I live that I'm a Christian. That doesn't exist. There's no secret service branch of Christianity or of the Lord's church. We can't claim Jesus only when it's convenient for us. You think about it right here, in this setting, around kindred spirits, hey, it's very convenient for us to claim allegiance to Jesus. I'll stand up for Jesus right here and right now. Well, it's easy to do right here and right now. But there's lots of other times in our life when it's not going to be easy to do, and we need to be mindful of the example of Peter here, lest we repeat the example of Peter here. Dad put the comment in here from James chapter 4 and verse 8 about draw near to God, and He will draw near to you, following from afar. It doesn't work out well when we're a disciple of Jesus, and that's a great verse to bring into this discussion. If we want to be able to stand up for Jesus, we're not going to be able to do that at arm's length. That only happens when we're near to the Lord, when we're close to Him and close to Jesus. I did want us to think for just a quick second and kind of review in some ways by just asking, well, how did this happen with Peter? We've seen the accumulation of several things, but let's actually just kind of add it up and score it. How exactly did this happen with Peter? I think it's several things as you think back to the previous chapters. First of all, Peter boasted too much. We saw 2 or 3 places just in the last chapter or so where Peter's just jumping up there and is so boastful, boasted too much, boasting in himself. Secondly, he listened too little. Jesus is telling him, hey, this is what's going to happen tonight. And evidently, Peter didn't listen, or even if he did listen, he didn't listen well enough to actually believe it. So he didn't listen well. Thirdly, he prayed too little. Wasn't that the rebuke that Jesus gave him in the garden? He said, pray that you do not enter into temptation. Maybe if you'd have been a little bit more prayerful, maybe these whole circumstances would have turned out differently. Fourthly, Peter acted too quickly. Again and again, we've just seen just that impulsive, impetuous nature of Peter where he just acts without really thinking things through. That's the part of Peter that probably I identify the most with. And then this last thing, and that is that Peter just followed too far. Instead of being close to the Lord, he's following at a distance. You put all of those pieces together, and it leads up to this just colossal failure on this occasion. And as I said a moment ago, it is a wonder that Peter didn't go out and do what Judas did. But thankfully, Peter does end up learning from this mistake. When Jesus had told him that Satan has desired to sift you like wheat, he then concluded that statement in Luke chapter 22 by saying that after all of this is over, you're going to turn. That is, you're going to repent. You're going to come back to me. And when you do, strengthen your brothers. Encourage them. And that's Jesus saying, kind of foreshadowing, that your job is to learn from these mistakes and then help them, help your brothers, help others so that they don't make these same kinds of colossal failures. And of course, we know that Peter does do that, does it in a great way, preaches that gospel sermon on the day of Pentecost where 3,000 souls are converted. He writes 1st and 2nd Peter, all kinds of other things that Peter does. I think it's safe to say that he did learn from this just milestone, low moment in his walk with the Lord. Other final thoughts here about Peter from chapter 14. Well, chapter 15 here's the penultimate moments of Mark's gospel, where we are now in the morning hours, the daylight hours now. The remaining hours of darkness have now passed, and we've now come to the daylight moments, because verse 1 tells us here in chapter 15 and in verse 1 that as soon as it was morning, the chief priests held a consultation with the elders and with the scribes and the whole council. And they bound Jesus and they led him away and delivered him over to Pilate. It's a little bit earlier. They've already kind of come to their verdict as to what they're going to do with Jesus. We want this guy dead. And so what they do here, now that it is morning, we're talking maybe 5 to 6 a.m. when the daylight hours are beginning, the Sanhedrin Council now comes together once more, and now we're going to kind of just go through the motions of an actual court proceeding. Because we talked about last week, what they did in the evening was illegal. That was wrong. They should not have done that. And so now here in the morning hours, while it's daylight, now we're doing this in a public way, now we're going through the process, the formality of an official trial, and that way we can then deliver him over to the next stage of this trial process. The Jewish part of all of this is really now done. We've done what we're going to do. Now it's time for the Romans to do the part that we need them to do. And why is it that the Jews here, why is it that the council, why is it that they need to get the Romans involved? What's the point of getting the Romans involved? Why don't the Jews just kill him? They're not allowed to. If you read John's account in John chapter 18, when they bring him to Pilate, Pilate's like, hey, why don't you just judge him? You all take care of him. And they make the point, hey, we can't do that. Our law doesn't allow that. The fact of the matter is that the ius gladii, that is the power of the sword, the power of execution, that belonged to the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire, when they overtook a territory, a country, or a city, that meant that they then also took over the authority to be able to do executions. And so Israel, of course, is occupied by the Romans, and so they are the ones who actually have the authority to do that killing. And so, hey, we need you guys to now do really kind of the dirtiest part of this job. We need you to complete this and finish this guy off so that we can now be fully done with him. And so they bring him to Pilate. And as we're introduced here to Pilate, I just want to say up front that I think in some ways Pilate is a rather tragic figure. He's really just an additional pawn in this story, in this play, that God is really the orchestrator of everything. God is the one who really is the one who allows His Son to be killed. In fact, Pilate later on is going to talk about how, hey, Jesus, don't you know that I have the power to free you or to crucify you? And Jesus is going to make the point, you don't have any power. The only reason you even have any power to do anything is because God is allowing these things to happen and allows you to do the things that you're doing. Pilate is just tragic in the sense, though, that I think he recognizes that Jesus is innocent. And he recognizes that there is going to be blood on his hands. His conscience is going to be afflicted if he goes through with the execution of this man. And so what we're going to see here is we're going to see Pilate try every way that he possibly can to get out of executing Jesus. He does not want to execute Jesus, and there's lots of reasons for that. And so, read with me again, verse number 2 now. Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Now, you should know that the Jews actually had brought several different accusations when they brought Jesus to Pilate. In fact, go ahead and grab verse 3. Verse 3 says that the chief priest accused Jesus of many things. So we're going to try to just throw as many things at the wall in hopes that Pilate will at least grab one of them and find that at least one of those charges will be worthy of executing this man. And so they throw all kinds of charges. Well, when you read Luke's account in Luke chapter 23 and in verse 2, there's at least 2 or 3 things that they accuse Jesus of. They say, first of all, he's perverting our nation. That is, he's misleading our people. You know, we're supposed to do this, and this guy's telling us things that ought not to be done. They specify that more clearly with the second charge, and that is, he's forbidding us to pay taxes to Caesar. Which then leads to the third thing, and that is this guy claims to be the Messiah. He's claiming to be a king. Now, all of those charges are false. All of those are lies. At least the last one in particular, you might be thinking, well, there's a sense in which Jesus was claiming to be a king because he was claiming to be the Son of God, and that is true. But when they come to Pilate and say he's claiming to be a king, they're not talking about a spiritual kingdom. They're not trying to explain that to Pilate. No, they're just wanting to say, hey, this guy's saying he's a king and he's trying to trump your all's king. He's trying to trump the Caesar. All of these things are lies. And again, they're just trying to get something that might be able to, maybe he'll grab one of those things and work with it. And the one that Pilate does grab onto is that last thing, that this guy's claiming to be a king. And so he asked Jesus that question. I think it's probably a fair question at this point for Pilate to ask in verse 2. Are you? Are you, what you've been accused of, are you King of the Jews? I want you to notice what Jesus' response is, because Jesus answered him, you have said so. In other words, this is kind of a qualified affirmation. Jesus is not giving a complete affirmation to the question. He qualifies it a little bit because in a sense, it is true. Was Jesus the king of the Jews? Yeah. He's also the king of the Gentiles. He's king of everybody in that sense. But again, in the sense that Pilate understood it, it wasn't true. Jesus wasn't trying to be some king of this separate little nation here, and we're going to rise up against the Romans. That's the accusation that's being made against him. And so Jesus kind of gives kind of a halfway affirmation. That's what they're saying? Okay, well then that's what they're saying. You've said so. Verse 4, Pilate again asked him, have you no answer to make? Got all these charges being leveled against you. Have you no answer to make? See how many charges they are bringing against you. Verse 5, but Jesus made no further answer, so that Pilate was amazed. We made note of this when Jesus was brought before the Sanhedrin the first time, how he didn't answer any of the foolish things that were being levied at him. And here once again, same thing. The fulfillment of Isaiah 53 and in verse 7 that like a sheep brought before its shears is silent, so he in the same way, he opens not his mouth, Isaiah 53 verse 7 says. And it says that Pilate was amazed, and I don't know, if I was Pilate, I probably would be amazed as well. I mean, these people want you to die. If I'm brought before the governor of Rome, or at least of this province of Rome, a guy who does, to some degree, have the authority to punish me and potentially put me to death, if it was me, I'd probably be saying something. I'd be putting up some kind of a defense. I'd be saying all kinds of things. I'd talk about, hey, that's a lie, that's a lie, that's a lie. These things people have said. Jesus doesn't do any of that. Gives just this halfway affirmation to the King of the Jews accusation, and then just leaves it at that. Jesus is allowing God's plan to be brought to its fulfillment. I'll pause right there. Thoughts through the first 5 verses of chapter 15. It is right here, somewhere in the seam of verse 5 and verse 6, that Pilate catches wind that Jesus is a Galilean. And he knows that Herod, who is kind of in charge of the Galilee region, Herod's in town, Herod's in Jerusalem. And so he has the bright idea, well, hey, this guy's in Herod's jurisdiction. Let me send him over to Herod. Again, this is the attempt by Pilate to, I'm going to get rid of this guy. I don't want to deal with this fella. I don't want to have to go through with all the procedures with this guy because Pilate recognizes this guy hasn't done anything that's worthy of punishment or necessarily even worthy of death. After Herod gets done with him, Herod then sends him back to Pilate. And so we have here then at verse 6, this is now the third round of the Roman trials of Jesus. He comes back to Pilate this second time. And so we then pick up in verse 6. Now at the feast, that is the Passover, which is still going on, at the feast, that's Pilate, he used to release for them one prisoner for whom they asked. Now, this is a custom that it's kind of hard to know exactly when this began and where this began, the custom of releasing a prisoner during Passover week. But it seems that this was not only intended to be just kind of a token gesture from the Romans to the Jews, but this was also meant, at least on the part of the Jews, to be kind of symbolic for them. And it was meant to be a reminder for them to build off of the imagery of the original Passover. Because in the original Passover, when it took place back in the book of Exodus, what that was all about was about these Israelites being able to be brought out of imprisonment, slavery in Egypt, and being delivered by the power of God. And so this idea of now we're going to deliver a prisoner out of this bondage, it's not slavery necessarily, but the bondage of imprisonment, that's going to recreate for that, and it's going to help us be reminded of how God did that for us. And I don't know, I think there's something about that maybe that's good, All those things are good symbolic reminders of who they were and the things that God had done for them. And so Pilate now is ready to use, he's going to pull out that particular card. Maybe this is a way that I can get Jesus to be released. All right, we've got him in prison, we've got him, tied up and ready to do something with him, but maybe this is the out to get rid of him. Verse 7. And among the rebels that were in prison, who had committed murder in the insurrection, there was a man called Barabbas. We don't know specifically, there's lots of discrepancy as to maybe what specific event this might be making reference to in verse 7, the insurrection that's being talked about here. And I'll not try to delve into all of the possibilities of that, but whatever it was, we're talking about some kind of a formal uprising against the Roman government. Which again, when you think about the things that would have made the Romans just the maddest about, anything that looked like a mob, anything that looked like some kind of a, formed group effort to overthrow the Roman government, that was severely frowned upon. And so there's this guy named Barabbas who's in custody. And I think Pilate probably picked this guy specifically because he knows this guy is the worst of the worst. It says he's a murderer. And so I'm going to bring up just the worst possible candidate to put up here side by side with Jesus, and surely they're going to say, release Jesus. Because we don't want this guy. We don't want this, maybe murderer is not even a strong enough word. This guy's a terrorist. That's probably the more accurate word to use here to describe Barabbas. We don't want this terrorist to be released back out among us and be set free. Pilate would be wrong about those guesses. Verse number 8, and the crowd came up, and they began to ask Pilate to do as he usually did for them. And he answered them, saying, do you want me to release for you the King of the Jews? For he perceived that it was out of envy that the chief priest had delivered him up. But the chief priest stirred up the crowd to have him release for them Barabbas instead. Remember how we talked about a few sessions ago about how there was concern about all the crowds who loved Jesus so much when Jesus made his triumphal entry into Jerusalem. They're firmly on Jesus' side, and there was concern about that. But how fickle these people are. And this says something again about just the nature of a crowd, the nature of the mob mentality. You just get a few folks worked up, sprinkle them in amongst a big group of people, and before you know it, you start to have anarchy. That's what's happening here. All of the people are now turning against Jesus. Verse number 12, and Pilate again said to them, then what shall I do with the man that you call the King of the Jews? This says to me that, all right, you guys want Barabbas released to you? Okay, I'm going to give you what you want if that's really what you want. But that still leaves me with this Jesus fella. I've still got him in custody. What in particular do you want me to do with him? And I think that says that crucifixion was not on Pilate's mind. All right, maybe we can punish him in some other way. Pilate's going to order him to be flogged here momentarily, scourged, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. Maybe just give this guy a severe beating, throw him in jail for 30 days, something like that. Crucifixion is not on his mind. And I think he maybe was shocked when he then hears the response of the people there in verse number 13. They cried out again, crucify him. And Pilate said to them, why? What evil has he done? But they shouted all the more, "Crucify him." So Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, released for them Barabbas, and having scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified. And so Pilate ultimately ends up caving to, peer pressure would not even be the right term. He just caves in to just the strong pressure of the majority. That's what's going on here. And Pilate, once again, he doesn't want a mob to break out. He doesn't want a riot to break out here. That's going to put him out of favor with the Caesar and with the higher-ups and his superiors. And so, hey, all right, give these people what they want. Just kill this guy if that's what they want to do. Get rid of him, and then I can proceed on and carry on with the rest of my life. Pilate had the opportunity to do the right thing, and he didn't do it. He cowered it out. In much the same way, he's kind of like Peter here. He had the opportunity, stand up for Jesus, say the right thing, do the right thing, but the pressure of the moment caused him to cower and fear, and he did not act according to what his conscience probably was telling him to do. Now, there's more I certainly want to say about scourging, as verse 15 just makes brief mention of, and really that's all that the Bible says about the scourging. But I do want to talk about that. I'm going to save that for next week. Don't have time to get into that tonight. What do you want to say about this paragraph here before we close? About Jesus before Pilate. There are, of course, other details that are given in the other gospel accounts. There's the famous moment where Pilate does the hand washing and all of those sorts of things. Stuart's got the comment on the chat that people today still don't know what they want. Only God knows what is best, and that's the reason for us to pray diligently. And that's certainly true. I tend to think that there maybe were lots of people in that crowd that were just shouting things, maybe without even recognizing what they were shouting. There's a riot that breaks out in the book of Acts that we read about, and Luke tells us in there that a bunch of those people in the middle of that big crowd, they were angry and upset, and they didn't know what they were upset about. And that probably was true even here in this big scene with Jesus here at the doorstep of Pilate. People are just shouting and just going along with the mentality, not even really knowing what they're saying or what's going on. But again, that's just the nature of human beings when we get around other groups of human beings. And it is unfortunate. There's a lot that could probably be said about just what a sad scene this is. Talked about how alone Jesus has been in the moments leading up to this. Think about how alone he must feel right here. And there's not anybody who's willing to speak up and to say, don't do that, or at least anybody that has any real authority or has a voice that's able to be heard, that's able to stand up for him and say, stop, this isn't right, and here's the evidence why you shouldn't do this. There's nobody. He's all alone. He is forsaken by all in this moment, and it's going to lead to the great torture that he's about to endure with the scourging and the crucifixion. Final parting shots before we close it right there. All right, next week, Lord willing, we'll come back there to verse 15, and we'll talk a little bit about the scourging, and then we'll talk about the crucifixion and the events that took place on the cross. Appreciate everybody's good attention and your participation this evening, and look forward to studying again next week.